What I have here is the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1650 Super, which would have came out in 2019. And we're going to take a look today and see how it holds up in 2022. Now, before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you would hit the like and subscribe button. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment box down below. I try to respond to every comment that I get. Now, if you want to skip right to the benchmarks, I'll leave a timestamp down below in the description, and you can skip right ahead. We'll do a brief overview of the 1650 Super. It is based on the 20 series, so like the 2060, 2070 GPUs. It's based on the Turing architecture, similar to those GPUs, and it has a 1.4D display port, a 2.0 HDMI port, and a DVI port. So it does have plenty of video output for a GPU of this caliber. Now, what makes the 1650 unique, 1650 Super unique, is that NVIDIA released this during the same time period as the 20 series release, but this card is more comparable to the 1060 3GB, and it's a little bit worse than the 1060 6GB. And what's unique is that the 1060 came out in about 6 years ago versus this only coming out 4 years ago. So with current GPU prices tanking because of we got the new generation coming out here within the next month, as well as crypto mining going bust, you're going to see a lot of used newer cards going on the market. With that, people will start upgrading. So some people will be upgrading probably their 1060, 1650 Super, ones that are in that range, to a newer model. And those of you who are on a tighter budget will be able to pick up something like this for much cheaper. During the pandemic, this sucker was going for $300, $400, $500 US more, which is ridiculous for something like this. But now you can probably pick it up for $100 or less in your local market using like Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji. eBay still has these up a little bit more than that, but looking around on your local market, you can probably find a much better deal on something like this or a comparable GPU. So if you would be interested in upgrading to something like this, you might be using integrated graphics or a much older graphics card. There's going to be benchmarks later in this video. Again, like I said, you can check out the description if you want to move right along to that. But what I would like to mention is with this, I probably wouldn't go with anything less than something like a 7700, Intel 7700. It's a 4-core, 8-thread processor, and it's still got quite a bit of power to it, and it would be a perfect match for something like this. Anything lower than that, I would not use a dual core or any of the older 4 cores. The 7700 is probably the minimum that I'd go with that. On Steam, as you can see, the most popular CPUs are the 4-core and 6-core. They don't tell you what the exact model is, but I would take a guess that the 4 cores are probably an i7 7700, i7 8700, and the 6 cores would be something around the Ryzen 1600 and 2600. And all these CPUs came out around the same time as the NVIDIA 10 series and 16 series. Which makes sense because they would line up with purchasing the GPU with the similar spec CPU that would have came out at the time. Performance-wise, the GPU that I'm using, the 1650 Super, would be smack in the middle of the two most popular GPUs, which is the 1650 and the 1060. It would be slightly better than the 1650 and on par with the 1060 3GB, but a couple of years after that one was released, they came out with the 1066 gigabyte, which is a little bit faster than the 1650 Super. So my system running the Ryzen 5 3600 and with the 1650 Super is comparable to the most popular hardware on Steam. Coincidentally, this hardware is also close to the recommended hardware for some of the newer games like Cyberpunk, and it's on the minimum spec list for some of the more recent games like Elden Ring, which requires a 1060. The 1060 is starting to show its age. However, I would imagine that it would still be a solid performer in the coming couple of years, just because developers will want to make their games accessible to the greatest number of people possible. And looking at this graph, it's like 7 of the 10 most popular games are from 4 years ago or even further back. So that's a big chunk of gamers they would alienate if they were continuously increasing the minimum spec requirements needed for their games. Now, I don't have any games in my library from 2022, but I ran benchmarks on 2 games from 2021 and 2 older games, plus Warzone, Fortnite, and Halo Infinite. The first 4 games were ran using the game's built-in benchmarks. That way you can ensure the consistency for all the games. And I just used their setting presets of low, medium, or high. After that, I didn't tinker with the settings. Starting with Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is also the oldest game on the list, the 1650 Super ran this game at all settings pretty well. On the very high, the lows did dip down to 25 FPS, but the average is still pretty high at 51. And as we decrease the settings, the average FPS definitely got much higher. And looking at this graph, I would go with the high setting as a sweet spot for performance and visuals. So with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, all the settings at 1080p have an average FPS over 60, as you can see here. With the lows to very high coming in at around 50. Again, very good performance, which it should be since this game came out several years ago around the same time frame as the 1650 Super's release. Now we're going to move on to the newer games, starting with Cyberpunk 2077. And you're still seeing very good average FPS. However, you can tell that this game is more graphically intense compared to the first 2 that we were looking at, but it is still putting up respectable average FPS on the high settings of 54. But when you knock it up to ultra, it is it takes a real impact to the GPU. And then lastly, of the most recent games to come out on the list is Forza Horizon 5. Still graphically intense game, but has pretty good FPS up to high. And then when you get to ultra, the FPS actually drops considerably, same as with Cyberpunk 2077. So as you can see with the single-person open-world games, the 1650 Super holds up very well, and you can expect similar performance for a 1650 or 1060 6GB or 1060 3GB. I do not recommend, however, the 3GB version of the 1060, just because from what I've been seeing when I was playing the game, each game used at least 3.5 GB of VRAM, which might cause some stuttering with the 3GB model as scenes are being rendered. I definitely, if you could get it, get the 1060 6GB model instead. Or on the flip side, which I haven't mentioned, there's also the comparable, the RX 580, comparable to 1060. That one can come with 8GB of RAM. That's another solid pick if you can find it used for a good price. So the next set of games that we're going to be looking at are open world battle royale type games. With these games, you might notice that a 4-core can cause some stuttering from the CPU, just not being able to keep up with all of the activity happening on screen. These type of games have a lot of CPU intensive tasks from the number of players that are in game that the CPU has to keep track of. As you can see on the spreadsheet, Warzone on low can't even hit 60 FPS at a minimum, and I didn't bother putting the numbers up for other settings because the performance was horrible when I tried it. These types of games, you want the smoothest play possible, and during heavy team fighting, you don't want your FPS dropping too low as it can cause stuttering and will just impact your gameplay. And this also applies to the 2 other games on the list as well. So compared to Warzone, Fortnite's graphics are less demanding and will let you play at a higher settings. However, you might not want to do that. You might want to keep it at the lower settings so you can have higher FPS. And then Moving on to Halo Infinite, which is a newer game and is more demanding on the GPU, same as Warzone. You're having the same problem where if you move up from low settings, you're going to have a hit to your performance with decreased FPS, which can cause some stuttering during the multiplayer part of the game. However, during the campaign mode, you probably won't have much of an issue there. For my final thoughts, these GPUs are still usable for today's games if you're more interested in playing these games for the story and don't really care about having the highest settings. For how much longer, really don't know. You might be able to get another year or two out of them if you plan on playing the newest AAA titles. Other than that, they're still great GPUs, and if most of the games you're playing are 2 or more years old, you'll notice considerable improvement over your older cards or integrated graphics. And if you have found this video helpful, please subscribe, like the video. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them down below. I try to respond to all my comments. Thank you. Have a good one.